Like I said, we're going to focus primarily on a little bit of early development and then talk about social development and gender. So when we're talking about development, we're talking about across the lifespan, including infancy, childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. We've already talked. I want to spend a little bit talking about prenatal development and some issues there. Again, this is a very quick hit of the highlights. When I had a little more time in the semester, I've shown this longer video. It's available. It's actually in Canvas if you want to watch the journey of the prenatal environment. It's about an hour long. It's really interesting. I'm not going to require you to, but if it's something you're quite interested in, please take a look at that. We'll start with prenatality. There are 3 prenatal stages from conception to birth that we will talk about. So we start with a fertilized egg. That then becomes a zygote, then becomes a blastocyst. These first stages start real quick. So first stage is, of course, conception, where we have a fertilized egg becomes a zygote. It then starts to develop. It will then get implanted in the uterine lining and then start developing. The germinal stage is this first sort of 2-week period that begins at conception. So we have the fertilizing of the egg. It travels down the fallopian tubes if it's not already made that journey. And then will implant itself in the uterine wall, which has prepared itself for pregnancy. That's the whole purpose of the 28-day menstrual cycle, is to prepare women's bodies for pregnancy. Of course, if a pregnancy doesn't occur, then the uterine lining gets released, and of course that's the menstrual period itself. So we start with this germinal stage, first 2 weeks. We then get the zygote, which is the fertilized egg that contains chromosomes from both the sperm and an egg. Sperm, of course, contains either an X chromosome or a Y chromosome. Eggs are entirely X chromosomes. So it's the, of course, sperm of the father that determines the biological sex of the fertilized zygote. Well, actually, it's not even anywhere closely sexually differentiated, and we'll talk about that when we start talking about sex and gender, probably on Wednesday. So we have the zygote, which is really just this fertilized cell that then starts to develop and become the blastocyst. So with the germinal stage, we then move into the embryonic stage. This is the period that lasts from about the 2nd week until about the 8th week. Now we start getting the developing embryo. This is the point at which women are sort of most likely to start becoming aware of the fact that they're pregnant. Of course, one of the problems is that a great deal of development happens in these first 8 weeks. And so we have to kind of be mindful of what's happening in this time period. And the fetal stage then is from the 9th week till birth. So most of the time we're talking about a fetus. The embryo lasts until about 8 weeks. Prior to the first 2 weeks, we call that the germinal stage. So the germinal stage, the embryonic stage, and the fetal stage. Most of the development occurs during, of course, the fetal stage. We go from week 8 to the end of the 9th, from week 9 until the end of the pregnancy at hopefully around 9 months. Of course, it's somewhere in that time frame. Some people are born premature. The more premature a birth is, the more problematic. So it's always best that an infant go to full term, but certainly prenatal care has gotten to be, neonatal care has gotten to be pretty remarkable in terms of what is a viable fetus in these days. One of the things that's occurring during the fetal stage is myelination. So we start to get the formation of the fatty sheath around the axons of neurons. So we start getting some pretty significant neural development. Certainly in a developmental class, we'll talk a lot about the actual brain development. There's a whole lot that's happening in terms of how brain develops. We're not going to spend a great deal of time in that. If you're really interested, you can watch my physio-psych development lecture that's on YouTube. They have nothing to do over the weekend and are really just jazzed about prenatal birth and brains. You can sit and listen to me talk about that for a while. So important to understand the prenatal environment is in some ways very fragile. So it's an environment that affects the unborn baby in many ways. The placenta is, of course, what links the bloodstreams of the mother and the unborn infant that permits the exchange of materials. So this is how an infant's provided with oxygen and nutrients, and waste products from cells are then taken back out through the mother's bloodstream and excreted via the kidneys and the liver. This placental barrier is not particularly great. That is, there's a lot that can cross from the mother into through the placenta into the infant. So basically what the mother eats, ingests, or is exposed to can affect development. The placental barrier can block some harmful substances, but it's not particularly efficient. It's nothing like the blood-brain barrier that protects the brain of the mother. The placental barrier is actually blocks some harmful things, but not all that many. So one of the direct problems with development is the potential introduction of what is called a teratogen. And a teratogen is just simply some substance that can damage the process of development. This can be drugs, this can be pesticides, and even viruses. So, for example, one of the reasons why measles is so problematic is measles can actually go from the exposed mother into the infant, into the born blind, or actually can result in stillborn babies. So measles is not something that is particularly problematic for mothers. Other types of typical teratogens are things like alcohol. The current CDC recommendations are for no alcohol consumption during pregnancy. There are certain specific time periods that alcohol is particularly problematic. So the safest bet is to abstain from alcohol altogether. We, of course, now have new things to worry about. Anyone know what the latest virus that's a teratogen came on the scene last year? Zika. Yes, the Zika virus is the latest problematic teratogen. It causes microcephaly, which is basically smaller heads, smaller brains. Not entirely clear how that's going to play out. One of the things that's problematic with Zika is it's not only spread by mosquitoes, but it's actually also sexually transmitted. And so, something to be careful of. I don't think anyone here is getting pregnant anytime soon, but think about it, when you are. Other things like smoking certainly has a known teratogen. There's my favorite quote from a tobacco executive who was testifying in front of Congress about the fact that women that smoked more had smaller fetuses or smaller newborns, and his quote was, "Well, some women prefer smaller babies," despite the fact that it's obviously a health risk. So clearly want to try to protect infants as much as possible. Some of the worst teratogens are things like thalidomide. Thalidomide was a drug used back in the 60s and 70s, and kids born with some pretty significant deformities. Most significant, we talked about those, of course, fetal alcohol syndrome, which is this developmental disorder that stems from heavy alcohol use by the mother during pregnancy. Relatively recent discovery, 70s, 80s, somewhere in there, in the 70s. Rather astute student, actually, if I understand the story correct, a resident, somebody had noticed this sort of distinct set of facial features of kids that were born to mothers of alcoholics, where the mothers were alcoholics. So you get these facial features like this. These are the thalidomide babies. But we certainly know alcohol exposure can result in a particular set of facial features, cognitive disruptions, behavioral disruptions, etc. As I said, smoking nearly doubles the risk of low birth weight babies. That's another thing to watch out for. Fortunately, smoking has declined pretty significantly, and very often you see pregnant women smoking. I was somewhere at some sort of festival one day, and there was a bunch of people protesting, all of us sinners. And one of them was pregnant, standing there smoking. And I thought, I don't know that you can throw any stones in your house over there. So smoking is certainly something to avoid. Prescription drugs, again, have to be very cautious. Thalidomide's a really extreme example if you really want to look into some extreme results. That's certainly one of those. Lots of lawsuits out of that. Want to just be very cautious during this development period. So as I said, this is going to be a bit of a skip through some of the phases. So now we have a born infant. So now we get a nice, live, happy, giggling, squealing baby. And for 18 to 24 months is what we refer to as infancy. There are a number of things that occur very quickly during these first 24 months. We get rapid development of the visual system. In fact, a newborn's born with really poor eyesight. By the time they're 24 months old, they've pretty much developed most of their visual abilities. This is when depth perception starts to develop, so we talked about that. So if kids have strabismus or amblyopia, you want to get that fixed. One of the things we start to use as a measure in this time period is what we call preferential looking. So cognitive psychologists that are interested in studying things like memory in infants will use preferential looking paradigms, because infants prefer to look at things they haven't seen before. They like to look at novel stimuli. This is why when you're out at a restaurant and there's an infant nearby, they find you so fascinating because you're new. Like, mom and dad are old. I've seen them before, but you're like a new face, and so they're really completely fascinated by you. They want to look at new things. And that's why that's happening. It's not that you have something on your face. It's just the infant finds you interesting because you're new and different. Well, from a cognitive psychology perspective, we can use that to determine whether or not an infant remembers something. That is, if they don't prefer to look at it, then they remember having seen it before, so it's no longer novel to them. So we can actually use this as a test of memory. And so that's essentially what people do. Newborns can mimic facial expressions within the first hour of life, so they can see facial expressions well enough. They also learn very quickly how to get attention, how to get their parents to laugh and smile. So there's a great deal of learning that goes on during this time period. I think I rather sarcastically quipped that infants are quite manipulative when we were talking about learning. It's not that really they are manipulative, I think they just learn very quickly how to get rewards, how to get their parents to pay attention to them. There's a great deal of learning that occurs on at this time. So as infants are developing, they have to strengthen their muscles and work on motor development. So it's one of the reasons they move and kick and do all sorts of other things. So motor development is the emergence of the ability to execute physical actions. Infants are born with a pretty specific set of reflexes. These are usually tested as soon as an infant's delivered. And we'll go through and test a number of things using what's called the APGAR scale. Are you familiar with this? The scale basically to determine whether an infant's born, sort of everything intact. But these reflexes are part of that. So the specific patterns of motor responses that are triggered by a specific sensory stimulation, which are innate. So these include, I'm sure these are probably covered in your textbook, but they include what's called the palmar grasp reflex. Anyone who's ever been around an infant, particularly a newborn infant, knows that when you put your finger in their hand, they like to grab a hold of it, which, is really cute and adorable. But that's one of the reflexes. The other is the plantar reflex. That is, if you touch the bottom of the foot, their foot should sort of crinkle up. What's the other one? There's a suckling reflex. If you touch the side of their cheek, they should turn to try to suckle on your finger. Yeah, it's called the rooting reflex. Sorry, I knew I'd come up with it. And that's, again, about developing the ability to nurse. So they're born with those abilities. They then start to develop more sophisticated behaviors as they get older, and they follow two specific rules. The cephalocaudal rule, which is a big, long word for top to bottom, basically describes the tendency for motor skills to emerge in sequence from head to feet. So they start with facial expressions, and move to hand movements, and then eventually, grabbing things, and then eventually they get to the point where they can walk. The other is the proximodistal rule. This is sort of the inside out. Again, describes the tendency for motor skills to emerge in sequence from the center to the periphery. So they can generally move centrally, but eventually they get better at getting further out. So from top to the bottom and from the midline to the outside is how these start to emerge. And so they start getting better and better. Anyone who's been around infants know that they start getting good at grabbing things. They'll pull themselves up. That's sort of one of the developmental timelines where they can stand up when they've got a hold of something. And then the sort of last thing that emerges is their actual ability to walk. So those are the first kind of motor development timeline issues. So this is kind of a basic general timeline. Again, the specific age at which these occur depends on infant by infant. They'll start by lifting their head when they're laying down, and eventually they get to where they can sort of chest up and support their arms, and they can roll over. They can bear a little weight on their legs, and they can sit up on their own. They can stand up holding on. They can pull themselves up to stand. They can walk while holding on to furniture. And they'll stand while alone, and then eventually, they're walking upstairs. So it's pretty rapid. By 14 months, they really developed most of their general motor abilities, and then of course get more fine-tuned over time. Unless you're like me and you're just clumsy and sort of stayed about there somewhere, trip over things and whatnot. Kidding, of course. So that's motor development. Cognitive development, we get the emergence of the ability to think and understand how the physical world works, think about how their minds represent it, how other minds represent it. These are the sort of direction in which we start to think about how cognitive development proceeds. There's lots of information out there about sort of memory and how long it lasts, and leave that for other courses. But as with other things, there is rapid development that coincides with a lot of other developmental timelines. So as we start moving into childhood and then into puberty, a lot of these things change rather rapidly. Some things develop entirely in infancy and early childhood, vision, hearing. But things like moral development, things like memory, frontal lobe executive functioning, those things don't finish developing until you're 19 or 20. First sort of attempt at thinking about how this all develops, some of the earliest attempts at that were Jean Piaget created these sort of cognitive stages of cognitive development. It's a useful framework for sort of thinking about how things develop. Not every infant follows this sequence of steps exactly. Everyone's a little bit different, but it's a useful way of sort of conceptualizing the ways in which we develop cognitively, and it's certainly important to understand sort of where this comes from. So Piaget's stages are an important part of this. Now, newer theories see these as being continuous and overlapping. Piaget viewed them as discrete. Once you're out of one, you're into the next, whereas we now sort of see these as overlapping, as continuous. People start moving through stages and sort of in and out of one stage versus the next. The other thing to know about Piaget is we think children acquire abilities a little bit earlier than he proposed, and part of that has to do with, I think, probably changes in nutrition, changes in developmental practices, all sorts of other things, right? Raise infants quite differently now than we did at the turn of the previous century, right? but it's still useful. So let's take a look at these different stages. We'll start with the sensory motor stage. This is birth to about 2 years. Infants acquire information about the world by sensing it and moving around within it, hence the cleverly titled name sensory motor stage. So they're looking at it and seeing it and wandering around in it. They start to develop certain attributes, so they start to get schemas about or models about the way the world works, some of which are accurate and some of which are not, but they start to understand how things work. They start to assimilate knowledge, the process by which infants sort of apply their schemas in novel situations. Infants love to drop things. Anyone ever been around an infant and know that they love to drop things on the floor? Well, that's what they're doing. They're assimilating let's see how that works. Let me see how long it takes somebody to come pick that up for me. They start to assimilate kind of knowledge through experimentation. Then they start accommodating that new knowledge. This is a process by which they revise their schemas in light of new information. So they start sort of testing out the world and then accommodating new information. It's basically learning. Important milestone in this area is the idea of object permanence. This is the idea that objects continue to exist even when they're not visible. So this starts to develop in this sensory motor stage. If you're wondering kind of what you need to know about this, something like what's occurring in which stage, probably something you'll want to know. So where does object permanence occur? About which stage does that usually occur? This starts to occur somewhere in this first couple of years. Easy to test, of course. It's the reason why infants like peekaboo, because you just suddenly disappear and don't exist to them anymore, right? It's also when you take an object and hide it from them, to them it doesn't exist anymore, and then they're super excited when it reappears, like it just sort of magically appeared from the mist. So, here this infant's very excited by its toy. You put this paper in front of it, and it's like, dude, what happened? It's gone. So to them, it just doesn't exist anymore because they think that it has simply gone into non-existence. So they'll simply learn that they continue to exist even though they can't see them. So that's one of the first major developmental milestones, this idea of object permanence. So as we're moving from sensory motor stage into the next stage, we move into the pre-operational stage, where they start to have a preliminary understanding of the physical world. So early on in the sort of pre-operational stage, they'll think that this is more liquid than this is. Sometimes it's hard to get adults to get past the pre-operational stage, I've discovered. You put something in a different glass, it just looks like more, right? This looks like it's more. I would rather have this than that, even though it's the exact same amount. I was actually at a bar with a friend, and we actually had somebody pour something from one glass into another. We were convinced they were different sizes, so... sometimes you'll never get past this, right? Because it's an easy illusion to happen. So we have this pre-operational stage, and then the concrete operational stage. Children learn how various actions or operations can affect or transform concrete objects. So this is the point at which you see when somebody pours one thing into the other, you realize it is actually the same size. In the pre-operational stage, you can actually take, let me back up 1 second, you can take and pour this into that, and they'll still say this was more, right? Whereas once you get to concrete operational, you become like us and say, nope, that's actually the same because I saw that physical transformation. You start to understand that despite it looking different, it's the same amount. So we get this with liquids. If you sort of smash down like a ball of clay, they'll still understand it's the same amount of clay. Conservation of numbers. Pre-operational kids will think this is more than this on the left, even though they're the same numbers. It's just this is taking up more space. So this idea of conservation is the notion that the quantitative properties of an object are invariant despite changes in the object's appearance. Children start to develop that ability in the concrete operational stage. finally, we get into formal operations, where children can solve non-physical problems and start thinking abstractly. So this is about the time that they start dropping those word problems on you in math class that you hated when you were 12 and 13 years old. You can start thinking abstractly. You can start applying mathematical principles or the non-physical ways and start thinking more abstractly. We'll take a look at the summary of these different stages and what they look like. Sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational, the general order in which these occur. Start to look like this. So, sensory motor, infant experiences the world through movement and senses. Pre-operational, still acquires motor skills but does not understand conservation of physical properties. Begins this stage by thinking very egocentrically, that is, the world revolves around them, and they don't understand other people's thoughts or feelings, but ends with a basic understanding of others' minds, and we'll talk more about this development of theory of mind here in just a second. We get into concrete operational. It can start to think logically about physical objects and events, understands conservation of physical properties, and then finally we get abstract propositions and hypothetical situations, and kids can start thinking in those ways. Assuming they make it that far. And I'm not convinced everyone makes it to the ability to think abstractly and hypothetically. So, one of the important parts of this part of development is this discovering of your own mind and other minds. So we move from infancy into childhood. So we start moving into childhood. Starts about 18 to 24 months and lasts into adolescence. We start off with a major egocentric problem, the failure to understand that the world appears differently to different observers, that you can't really see outside of your own body or own mind. So at this point they have difficulty understanding different emotional reactions in others until about 6 years of age. That is, they aren't able to see the world from other people's views yet. Still not convinced everyone can do that either, but that's an argument for another day. What starts to develop here is, and what separates this out, is this idea of theory of mind. And this is the idea that we can represent mental operations. In particular, understanding the mental representations of others. And so when we talk about development of theory of mind, it's really talking about how do I know what you know, or what your perspective is. So I'll show you the kind of example we use, or that people use in testing this in children. But I do want to note that children with autism and deaf children who do not use American Sign Language have difficulty with understanding other people's perspective. We think an important part of this has to do with language. There was once a strong theory that children with autism had some deficiency in empathy or in developing theory of mind. We think that that might be secondary to language development, because kids with autism tend to have language difficulties as well. But here's the example we use in terms of understanding what others know or feel. So, this is Sally. Sally has a basket. This is Anne. Anne has a box. Sally has a marble. She puts her marble in the basket. She goes out somewhere and takes the marble that is the size of her head and puts it in the box. I don't know who drew this, but it's an awfully big marble, isn't it? Or Anne's an awfully small child. I figured out which one it is. So now Sally comes back. Where is she going to look for her marble? Right? Well, kids that haven't developed theory of mind, what are they going to say? Anyone have an idea? Right. So kids that haven't developed theory of mind think, well, she knows it's in the box, because they don't realize she wasn't there to see it get moved. Kids that have developed theory of mind understand that she's going to look for it here because that's where she left it. Everyone see that distinction? So the ability to understand what somebody else knows or somebody else feels. And so this is a really kind of complex and important question developmentally, because understanding what other people know, think, and feel is a really important social ability, right? Understanding why other people are upset, understanding why what you did might have made them angry. Again, I'm not sure everyone's developed this ability sometimes. Obviously, as adults, we learn we do things accidentally or say stupid things. But usually you can figure it out, right? So this is an important part of our development. Another interesting part about this is learning is certainly, our development and our learning is very culturally based. Our expectations about others. Certainly one of the things we're going to be talking about either today or probably more in depth on Wednesday is gender development. And gender is very culturally specific. Some cultures don't have gender or don't have gender until later in life. So one of my friends is from Sierra Leone, and up until the coming of age ritual, there is no name for boys and girls in their sort of original language. That is, they're just simply men or women. They're children until they reach their coming of age, and then they become men or women. And so children sort of have no assigned gender at that point. It's really kind of interesting. So things happen as part of our culture include use of cultural tools such as language and our counting systems. And according to Vygotsky, there are three important components for us to learn from others. One of these is joint attention. And there's some really, really interesting work on this idea of joint attention in a variety of instances. But the basic idea is that if you're both focused on the same thing, your ability to focus on what another person is focused on, this helps in cognitive development. So in studies about memory for museum visits, there's some really interesting data that show that kids will remember the things that they and their parents shared together and talked about. That is, they both focused on, they both kind of shared the experience. Parents have a tendency sometimes to just turn their kids loose and sort of walk behind them in museums. And the best thing to do is to actually talk with them about displays, because that's what they're actually most likely to remember. So this idea of joint attention is really important. Social referencing is the ability to use another person's reaction as information about the world. So seeing how people react and being able to adjust your behavior and think about that accordingly. And then imitation, the ability to do what another person does. This is where some of the research in autism has focused, because this seems to be another potential deficit for autistic kids. So for example, it's very hard for autistic kids to learn how to tie their shoes, because we tend to learn how to do something like that by imitating others. And that seems to be one of those areas that's difficult for us. So these are the three sort of fundamental skills that allow us to sort of learn from others and learn together as part of our culture. And there's certainly a great deal of that. So this is an example kind of joint attention where they're both looking and paying attention to the same thing. And so you see this in lots of different stages of development where this kind of joint attention helps to facilitate learning. Any questions on that? Well, as I said, I wanted to kind of briefly introduce some of the cognitive development. There's a whole lot more to learn in this area, but I want to talk about social development. We're going to start by talking about attachment. And attachment's a really important part of understanding social development. It's one of those things that comes up in a lot of other courses. It certainly will come up on the MCAT. For any of you who are planning on taking that. So we'll start first with what attachment is, talk about its adaptive nature, talk about infant attachment styles and separation anxiety, and then talk about the biological basis for attachment. So attachment is a strong, intimate, emotional connection between people that persists over time and across circumstances. we've all know what it means to become attached to someone, right? From an infant development perspective, we're talking about infant and caregiver developing a sort of two-way attachment bond. So that infant attachment leads to heightened feelings of safety and security. So a securely attached infant is going to feel safe and secure, and is going to behave very differently from an anxious child or an insecurely attached child or an anxious-avoidant child. So these attachment styles are particularly important. So that's what attachment is. Well, why is it important? Well, it motivates infants and caregivers to stay in close contact. So development of attachment is part of what ensures the sort of propagation of a species, because your offspring have to survive long enough to have their offspring, right? So attachment's an important part of getting caregivers to stay in contact with their infants and infants to stay in contact with their caregivers. We have an innate predisposition to respond to infants. It is a basic built-in biological drive for us to respond to infants. This is why a crying infant on an airplane is so aversive. Because we are biologically driven to try to fix that particular problem. So a crying infant is one of those things that we can't ignore it. We find it very aversive because we're supposed to try to fix whatever is problem with the infant. Of course, when it's not our infant, there's nothing we can do about it. And infants really aren't biologically, designed to travel on airplanes. Our evolution hasn't caught up there yet, right? Things like acting distressed when a caregiver leaves and rejoicing at the return of a caregiver helps secure the attachment of the caregiver, right? This is how this bond develops, is you're upset when they leave and you're very happy when they come back. Right? This is how we become attached to infants or pets, all sorts of different ways in which we have this kind of basic attachment, because we see that they are very happy that we've returned. Same thing with our significant others. All of that's part of this attachment development. So that's why this is an important part of this, is we actually can develop this kind of attachment and it helps secure the species. So what are the ways in which this develops? Well, the first thing to understand about attachment is this idea of separation anxiety. So this is distress and anxiety displayed by infants when their caregiver, when they're separated from the primary caregiver. We test out this idea of, well, not we, people not being me, but psychologists in the we sense, test infant attachment styles by using what's called the strange situation test. So this is a test of an infant caregiver attachment that involves observing how an infant responds to separation from their caregiver and how they respond when the caregiver returns. So depending on their attachment style will depend on how they respond in this strange situation test. So a securely attached infant will be distressed when the caregiver leaves and happy when the caregiver returns. But that doesn't always happen. So we have a secure child is one who is happy to play alone and friendly to the stranger while the caregiver is there. So a very securely attached child, as long as mom or dad or the primary caregiver is there, they're happy playing and doing whatever as long as the caregiver is there. Because they feel secure, mom or dad are here, I'll be fine. When the caregiver leaves, they'll cry and they'll be constantly looking for them to come back. Then when they return, the child's happy, quickly comforted, and they usually want to be held or hugged. They want to be comforted. So the keys to seeing a securely attached child is they're happy, doing things while mom or dad's present, so they feel secure. They'll explore their environment a bit. They'll always keep an eye on where mom or dad are. Then when the caregiver leaves, they'll be upset and they'll be looking for the caregiver, and then they're very happy that they've returned, quickly comforted, and then they want to be picked up, they want to be held, etc. So this is a securely attached child. It's really kind of the best state. An avoidant child does not appear to be distressed when the caregiver leaves. They can often be comforted by the stranger, and when the caregiver comes back, they just don't care. They'll ignore them, they'll snub them, whatever, because they're simply not attached. They don't care whether the person's there or not, so they're avoidant of their caregiver. Now, there are, and this is not an area that I'm an expert, but part of this is parental style, and we'll talk more about parental style as we get into this, but part of this also is potentially simply biological. That is, some are difficult infants and they just simply don't develop this kind of attachment as well. So it's not necessarily bad parenting, is what I'm trying to say. There is certainly a little bit of biology to this. There are lots of complex variables that go into the development of these different attachment styles. Avoidant children will also often approach a caregiver in sort of a tentative manner. As we start getting further into this discussion, we'll talk more about when we talk about personality as well, we'll talk about how these kind of have long-term implications as we go from attachment styles into temperament and into personality. So those are the avoidant children. The anxious-ambivalent are anxious the entire time. They will cling to the caregiver when they first enter the room. Uh-oh, stranger danger. And then when the caregiver leaves, they're completely inconsolable. And then when they come back, they'll both elicit and reject caring contact, like they'll want to be picked up and like, no, put me back down. And that's what we call this anxious-ambivalent, because they're anxious, but they're also ambivalent about the caregiver. We'll start again looking at how these have longer-term implications, how temperament and attachment are sometimes related, and how temperament can be associated with longer-term outcomes. But in general, right now we're talking about just this basic infant attachment style. This isn't a full comprehensive list either, just giving you an idea of the different kinds of styles that can, so these kind of start to combine into like anxious-avoidant, anxious-ambivalent, anxious, etc. Kind of combine these up. This gives you an idea of what this looks like. So how does attachment develop? There are a couple of different theories about how this occurs, but one of these we think has to do with what we call contact comfort. The social development is facilitated when an infant is allowed to touch something that is soothing. This is why we, sort of swaddle infants in very soft blankets, etc. And then want that kind of physical contact. So part of this research was developed by Gene Harlow and Harlow's monkeys, and what he discovered is they wanted this kind of contact comfort. So we have surrogate mothers for this adorable little monkey, one of which they're getting fed from and one of which they can just cling to. And it turns out, Harlow thought, or at least the original theory was that attachment occurs because mothers are the source of food, but they discovered that even though they were getting food from the wire, not sort of soft, fake mother, they much preferred to cuddle up and snuggle with the much softer mother. And so it's this idea that this attachment starts to develop due to this physical contact. One of the things we know from a more modern neuroscience perspective is that this is related to the release of the hormone oxytocin. And it's this hormone that facilitates attachment. There's been some question about whether or not you could substitute, sort of give people more oxytocin to try to change their attachment. hasn't been a lot of success in that area. Oxytocin is very difficult to deliver in a way that reaches the brain, tends to get broken down quite a bit. And there does seem to be something about this whole natural process that makes this more likely. But the release of this hormone is one of the things that physically creates this sense of attachment, this very significant bond between parent and child. So it's released in the mother during breastfeeding and facilitates milk release. And also appears to facilitate infant attachment to the mother during this process. Of course, fathers are just as well attached, and a lot of this has to come, we think, through that kind of contact hypothesis. That basic comfort is part of the ways in which fathers and infants become attached. And certainly fathers are sources of food as well. They provide bottles and whatnot. So that's a bit of the biological basis of the development for attachment. Questions about that? The next thing we want to get into is sort of who influences social development as we move from infancy into childhood. So one of the first things that develops are parental styles. Its importance really depends on infant temperament. So the infant's temperament oftentimes influences parental style, and the effect of parental style can have something to do with infant temperament. So temperament refers to the way in which behaviors are expressed. So attachment relates to attachment to caregivers. Temperament is sort of just general behavior in children. The first category of these we'll talk about is difficult children. They're obviously difficult children, often difficult temperaments. So this is where we start to look at this intersection between temperament and parental style. So parents who openly demonstrate frustration or insist on exposing the child to conflicts, this is the most associated with negative outcomes. Parents with a calm, consistent style are associated with positive outcomes with difficult children. So one of the keys to raising difficult children is consistency, being calm, firm, and that's associated with positive outcomes. Now, probably easier said than done, right? If you have to live with a difficult infant every day of your life, it's probably difficult to be that consistent and firm, but that's really important to get this kind of positive outcome. One other issue with parental styles is overprotective parents tend to encourage anxiety and distress, particularly, again, in difficult children, but in other children as well. So there's sort of this balance between being protective and overly protective. I'm sure some of you have experience with overly protective parents or friends who have overly protective parents, right? And this is one of those continuingly questions about what really is overprotective. Like, what is now normal parenting would have been really overprotective when I was a kid. Like, we were free-range kids. We walked to school and we saw our parents at night. But now, that would be completely neglectful parents if you weren't minding their every move. Friendships are another important part of social development. So parents are an important part of this. Friendships are an important part of this. As kids start to develop friendships, the way in which they interact starts to change. But early friendship tends to just consist of parallel play. So the kids are playing sort of near each other, doing similar things, but not necessarily together. Then as they start to get a little bit older, into the sort of early childhood, these start to lead to development of friendships. One of them, of course, is common ground activity. I'm sure many of you develop friendships at this stage because you were all involved in something similar, sport, clubs, something. You just had things you liked to do together. Start to develop clear communication, exchanges of information. So friendships develop because they can communicate, exchange information easily, resolve conflicts. No friendship occurs without conflicts. Kids start to develop that ability to resolve conflicts. If you can't resolve those conflicts, the friendship won't develop. And then finally, very importantly, is of course reciprocity. There has to be two-way friendships, right? This is of course something, as you start to get an adult, you start getting better at, right? Probably everyone in here has a story about a non-reciprocal friendship, right? There is some of that happens quite a bit. So you have to just be mindful of it. And certainly in kids, this is when they start to really develop their friendships. Around puberty, we start beginning to see more intimate sharing of details, fears, how much they hate their parents, that sort of thing. This is adolescence at its finest. They start sharing secrets with their friends. This is an important part of normal development. It's distressing to parents, right, because they want to know everything their kids are doing, but kids need to be able to have, their privacy, share secrets with their friends, etc. Questions about this? Well, parents and peers and how they work together. There is group socialization theory. This is the idea that children are socialized entirely by their peers. Not entirely likely that both social contacts play a role in social development. Importantly, parents seem to play a role in which crowd kids end up joining. So the peer group is important, but the parents themselves are likely to have influenced what the peer group ends up being, right? When we talk about crowds from a childhood development perspective, we're talking about what kind of group are you running with, right? What's your posse or squad, I guess it is these days. So crowds are then these sort of large groups of people, may or may not spend a lot of time together, but share sort of common social identity. So then you may have a sort of core group of friends within that crowd. But as you start forming these friendships, that kind of crowd is who you end up forming those friendships with. This is when you're in high school, it's, there's the jocks, there's the student council people, there's the journalism people, right? These are kind of loosely identified crowds of people. Stoners, probably. Still have those in school. Made a lot of those when I was in school. So just kind of hung out on things and smoked a lot. Cliques are smaller groups that serve as these sort of primary peer groups. So we have sort of larger crowds, and then you have this sort of smaller group that you run with. These are important development, and here's where cliques sort of get this negative connotation in their exclusivity. People don't want to socialize outside of their primary peer group. And I think that's problematic, certainly. But that's this sort of close-knit group of friends that are all kind of friends and do things together. And these things really don't change over time. You have groups of people that are their primary peer groups, and this is something that lasts well into adulthood. What I want to talk about for a moment is how we look at this from a how children are socializing perspective, and this we call sociometric analysis. This is one of the ways in which we sort of look at whether or not children are fitting in, where they kind of fit in the hierarchy. And so basically, children select peers that they like or dislike. You kind of end up with 4 different groups of people, or kids in this case. So we'll kind of walk through these, but we have popular children, a lot of likes, rejected children, a lot of dislikes, neglected children simply don't come up at all, and controversial children get both likes and dislikes. Start with the popular kids. Now, a lot of people like them, very few dislike them, reason why they're popular. Rejected children are the ones that a lot of people dislike and very few people like. So they're sort of rejected by the overall group. Then you have the neglected children. These are the kids that sort of are just in the background somewhere that nobody seems to know anything about. So they are neither liked nor disliked. They just simply aren't mentioned. And then the controversial children, a lot of people like them, a lot of people dislike them. I imagine you can all think of somebody in your school experience that would fit right into this category that a lot of people really liked and a lot of people really didn't like, right? But this is a way for us to assess what kind of peers does a child have, where do they fit into the social hierarchy, and then does that put them at risk in some cases? So the rejected and neglected children are probably the ones that are at most risk, so we want to kind of watch out for those. Rejected children tend to be withdrawn, disobedient, and rather aggressive, and why they probably aren't liked very much. Although my childhood days are long behind me, I'm in memory of a few of these kids that just didn't seem to last very long in schools, that were just very aggressive, very, just stood out as being sort of highly disobedient and aggressive. Any questions about that? All right, let me I forgot to add this. Let's do a quick. Oh, anybody need this attendance code before I do something with it? But not get the attendance code before I shut it. I need to add a new question. So, of course, they are sensory, motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. So those are the stages of Piaget's development. Now we're going to get into Kohlberg's more reasoning stages. So when we're talking about moral development, we're basically talking about the way in which people decide or come at their conclusions in moral dilemmas, so with competing social outcomes. So we're not necessarily talking about the answer to a moral dilemma, but the way in which children arrive at the answer is really the sort of question we're talking about. We talk about moral reasoning. This is a cognitive process. How do they reason through the problem? And of course we have moral emotions, which are more affective or emotional processes. So these moral dilemmas will have an emotional component to them, but the level of moral reasoning is related to the cognitive processes involved in talking your way sort of through why something is, what's the specific reason for coming up with the answer to a moral dilemma. So we're talking about Kohlberg's moral reasoning and Kohlberg's moral dilemma. And his moral dilemma is a classic one most of you have probably heard about, involving a man, his sick wife, and stealing from the drugstore. So we'll talk about this with his Kohlberg's moral development, talk about his stages, and then finish up with how parental practices are related to development through these particular stages. So this is the classic Kohlberg's moral dilemma. In Europe, a woman was near death from a special kind of cancer. There's one drug the doctors thought might save her. The druggist was charging 10 times what the drug cost him to make. He paid $200 but was charging $2,000. Sounds familiar. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow money but could only raise $1,000. He went to the druggist and asked to sell it cheaper or let him pay later. The druggist said, no, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money for it. So Heinz gets desperate, breaks into the man's store to steal the drug for his wife. Should the husband have done that? And of course, the question is, why do you provide that answer? So it doesn't matter whether or not you think the husband should or should not have done that. It's your reasons for why you come at that conclusion, according to Kohlberg, that puts you in different stages of moral development. So the pre-conventional stage, moral reasoning is based on personal beliefs, self-interest, or hedonistic advantages. So in this case, of course, the man should have stolen that because he loved his wife. Really just that simple. It was perfectly fine to be selfish. The druggist was being selfish. Of course, you can also say he should not have stolen it because the druggist deserved his money. He deserved his $2,000. The other man was wrong. Both of those are fine. It's the way in which you arrive at the answer that's the important part. So it's based on self-interest or hedonistic advantages. Moving into conventional stages, this reflects conformity to rules of law and order that are learned from others. So in the conventional stage, he shouldn't have stolen because he broke the law. Or the man shouldn't be allowed to charge that outrageous price because that should be against the law. Conventional, basic rule-based reasoning is what happens in this stage of moral development. So we move from selfish, self-interest, personal beliefs into conformity to rules of law, societal rules. Then we get into the post-conventional stage, which reflects more complex reasoning skills that take into account abstract principles and values. So now we start getting more nuanced views. While what Heinz did broke the law, he made every attempt to do this in a different way and was rejected. And so he took the only route available to him to save his wife, and that was to steal the drug. And so you get a much more nuanced view that's not based on rules, it's not based on self-interest, but is much more complex based on abstract principles of justice, for example. So what the druggist was doing was not just because he wouldn't sell the drug to Heinz for a lower price or let him pay for it later, and so Heinz was left with the only means possible, which was to steal the drug. So we get much more complex based on abstract principles like justice, which is a more moral view, the greater or lesser of evils, that sort of thing. According to Kohlberg, you can get sympathetic children, those who they're more on Heinz's side. If you have a high degree of sympathy, so sympathetic parents, children have parents who have a high degree of sympathy. are not hostile, allow children to express negative emotions in a manner that does not harm others, help them cope with negative emotions, and help promote understanding and focus on others. So part of this is, we all have negative emotions. We have to learn how to deal with them in a healthy way, learning how to cope with those, how to understand those emotions in others. These are things like trying to figure out, get children to understand that what they did harmed another child or upset them in some way. Here's why that is. So they are not hostile in the home. That is, there's not a great deal of hostility. And again, allow them to express negative emotions in a manner that does not harm others. So this is, again, important in getting them to understand the way to express negative emotions in a non-harmful way. So being upset is fine, but being upset and, hitting people or calling them names, etc., is not fine. So it's an important part of this kind of development. Children who are high in shame have parents who are very angry, are very lax in their discipline, and do not respond positively to appropriate behavior. So rather than saying, yes, that's the way you should behave, they're simply lax in their discipline, they're quite frequently angry, and don't respond positively to appropriate behavior. Any questions about this so far? So interactions between parent and child are important in the development of moral emotions. Reasoning with children is important. They need to understand cause and effect relationships and how their actions affect others. And this is, I think, really one of the most important things to understand about appropriate development, is kids need to understand why they're supposed to do things or not do things. So, how would you feel if Chris had done this, or if somebody else had done this to you? This is why that was wrong. This is why this person's upset. This is why you shouldn't do that. So you have to actually reason with them. And of course, the level of reasoning does depend on how old a child is. You can't really reason with a 2-year-old, right? But you can reason with a 6-year-old child, or a 10-year-old child, certainly. And that kind of moral development is going to depend on this kind of parent-child interaction. So these parental interactions are particularly important for that. Okay. Well, there's no point in starting gender today, so why don't we finish up there, and we'll pick up on gender identity and development on Wednesday.